The autumn evening painted the suburban streets in shades of amber and gold as a silver sedan cruised smoothly down Maple Avenue. Behind the wheel sat a distinguished man in his early 50s, dressed in a crisp navy suit. He was heading home after a long day at the police headquarters, where he had just wrapped up a community outreach meeting. The police chief had spent 27 years on the force, climbing through the ranks with unwavering dedication and integrity. Despite his position, he chose to live in a modest neighborhood, believing it kept him connected to the community he served. His thoughts drifted to the stack of reports waiting on his desk tomorrow when flashing lights in his rearview mirror caught his attention. He carefully pulled over, puzzled about the reason for the stop. His registration was current, and he hadn't broken any traffic rules. As he waited, he followed the protocol he had taught countless others: hands visible on the steering wheel, interior light on, calm demeanor. The approaching officer was young, probably in his mid-20s, and carried himself with an air of excessive authority that often came with inexperience. The beam from his flashlight swept across the car's interior before settling on the police chief's face. Something in the young officer's expression shifted, a subtle tightening around the eyes, a slight straightening of his posture. "License and registration," the officer demanded, his tone notably sharp. The police chief noticed the officer's hand resting near his holster, a gesture that spoke volumes about preconceptions and ingrained biases. "Of course, officer," the chief replied evenly, maintaining his composed demeanor. "I'm going to reach for my wallet now." He narrated his movements clearly, a practice born from decades of experience both as a law enforcement officer and as a black man in America. As he retrieved his credentials, the chief reflected on the countless similar situations he'd encountered throughout his life, both before and after joining the force. Each instance had strengthened his resolve to create meaningful change from within the system. The young officer's demeanor remained rigid as he accepted the documents. His flashlight beam lingered on the driver's license photo, then darted to the chief's face, then back to the license. The chief could practically see the gears turning in the officer's mind as realization slowly dawned. "Sir, I..." The officer's voice faltered, the authority in his tone evaporating as he recognized his superior. "Chief, I didn't." The police chief raised his hand gently, not in anger but in a gesture of understanding. "Officer Thompson," he read the nameplate carefully, "would you mind telling me why you pulled me over tonight?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Officer Thompson shifted uncomfortably, his confident stance from moments ago replaced by uncertainty. The chief noticed beads of sweat forming on the young officer's forehead despite the cool evening air. This moment, the chief realized, was more than just an uncomfortable traffic stop. It was an opportunity, one of those rare instances where real change could take root. He had seen both sides of this scenario countless times throughout his career, and he understood that what happened next could either reinforce divisions or build bridges. The streetlights cast long shadows across the scene as traffic occasionally passed by, each car's headlights illuminating snapshots of this pivotal moment. The chief maintained his calm demeanor, giving the young officer time to process the situation and formulate his response. In his mind, the chief was already planning how to turn this encounter into a teaching moment, not just for Officer Thompson, but for the entire department. These were the moments that shaped police culture, one interaction at a time. The chief had long believed that true change came not from grand gestures or policy documents, but from these small, personal encounters where biases could be confronted and transformation could begin. As he waited for Officer Thompson's response, the chief reflected on his own journey through the ranks, the challenges he'd faced, and the changes he'd witnessed over the years. This situation, though unfortunate, was an opportunity to continue that journey of progress, not through punishment or shame, but through understanding and education. The cool evening breeze carried the distant sound of sirens and city life, a reminder of the continuous flow of life and the ongoing work of law enforcement. The chief knew that what happened next would be crucial in shaping not just Officer Thompson's future approach to traffic stops, but potentially the department's broader understanding of bias and community relations. Officer Thompson cleared his throat, his hand dropping from his holster as he struggled to find the right words. The police chief noticed the young officer's badge gleaming under the streetlight. It couldn't have been more than a year old, still shiny and unmarked by time. "Sir, I observed your vehicle make what appeared to be." Thompson paused, his rehearsed script faltering under the weight of the moment. The chief waited patiently, knowing that growth often began in these uncomfortable spaces of self-reflection. "To be honest, sir," Thompson finally continued, his voice quieter now, more genuine, "I didn't have a valid reason to pull you over." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implications but also filled with potential for change. The chief nodded slowly, appreciating the young officer's honesty. He turned off his car's engine completely and asked, "Would you mind having a conversation with me for a few minutes, Officer Thompson?" His tone was warm but professional, creating a space for dialogue rather than confrontation. Thompson's relief was visible. "Of course, sir. I would appreciate that." He clicked off his flashlight, a subtle gesture that transformed the encounter from an official stop to a meaningful exchange between two law enforcement officers. The chief stepped out of his car, noting how Thompson instinctively tensed before catching himself. They moved to the sidewalk, away from passing traffic, where the yellow glow of a street lamp created a small island of light. "How long have you been on the force, Thompson?" the chief asked, though he already knew the answer from recent recruitment files. 8 months, sir," Thompson replied, standing at parade rest, not quite formal, but not fully relaxed either. "I graduated from the academy in March." The chief smiled, remembering his own early days on the force. 8 months, he repeated thoughtfully. "You know, I've been doing this job for nearly 3 decades, and I still remember my first year like it was yesterday. It's challenging, isn't it? Making split-second decisions, trying to keep everyone safe while following procedures." Thompson's shoulders relaxed slightly. "Yes, sir. Sometimes it feels like there's so much to consider in every situation." "There is," the chief agreed. "And then there are the things we don't even realize we're considering, our assumptions, our unconscious biases, our learned responses." He paused, letting the words sink in. "What went through your mind when you first saw my car, Thompson? Before you knew who I was?" The young officer shifted uncomfortably, but the chief's open, non-judgmental demeanor encouraged honesty. I saw a luxury sedan in a neighborhood where we've had some recent reports of drug activity. And..." He hesitated. "And you saw a black man behind the wheel," the chief completed the thought gently. "It's okay to acknowledge that, Thompson. We can't address our biases if we don't first acknowledge them." A couple walked their dog on the opposite sidewalk, their quiet conversation and the dog's tags jingling providing a momentary soundtrack to the night. The chief watched them pass before continuing. "Let me tell you something about this neighborhood," he said, gesturing to the surrounding homes. "I've lived here for 15 years. My neighbors include teachers, nurses, small business owners, hardworking people of all backgrounds. But I've been pulled over on this very street 7 times in those 15 years, always with the same vague explanations." Thompson listened intently, his expression shifting from discomfort to understanding. The chief could see the impact of his words in the young officer's eyes. "Each of those stops ended differently once the officers realized who I was," the chief continued. "But here's the thing, Thompson, my position shouldn't be what makes me worthy of respect and fair treatment. Every person we pull over, every citizen we interact with, deserves the same professionalism and respect, regardless of their title or appearance." A gentle breeze rustled through the trees, lining the street, carrying the sweet scent of someone's late-season barbecue. The chief took a moment to let his words settle. "I'm sharing this with you not to make you feel guilty, but because I see potential in you. The fact that you admitted to not having a valid reason for the stop tells me you're honest and capable of self-reflection. Those are crucial qualities for good policing. Thompson nodded, his posture now more natural, engaged. Thank you, sir. I never thought about it this way before. At the academy, we learned about bias, but it was always in theoretical terms. This is different. It is different, the chief agreed. Theory becomes reality on these streets, in these moments. Every interaction we have shapes not just that citizen's view of law enforcement, but their entire sense of justice and belonging in their own community. The chief glanced at his watch. It was getting late, but this was too important to rush. He could see the gears turning in Thompson's mind, real understanding beginning to take root. You know what the hardest part of my job is, Thompson? The chief asked, his voice taking on a more personal tone. It's not the paperwork, not the politics, not even the tough calls we have to make. It's knowing that every day, somewhere in our jurisdiction, someone feels less safe, less valued, less human because of an interaction with law enforcement that didn't need to go that way. Thompson's eyes met the chief's, and for the first time that evening, there was true connection rather than authority or hierarchy between them. How do we change that, sir? The chief smiled, hearing in that simple question the spark of transformation he'd hoped for. We start right here, Thompson. With honest conversations like this one. With officers like you being willing to learn and grow. And most importantly, with the understanding that our badge gives us responsibility, not superiority. As their conversation continued under the streetlight, a police cruiser rolled past slowly, the officer inside giving them a curious glance. The chief knew how unusual this scene might appear, the department's highest-ranking officer having a late-night sidewalk conversation with a rookie. But sometimes, the most important moments in policing happened outside the formal settings of roll calls and training rooms. You know what I see when I look at our department, Thompson? The chief asked, leaning slightly against the fence behind him. I see good people who want to make a difference. But I also see the weight of generations of misunderstanding and fear on both sides of the badge. Thompson nodded, his earlier nervousness replaced by genuine engagement. At the academy, they taught us about community policing, but it feels different on the streets. Sometimes it seems like there's already so much tension before we even step out of our cruisers. That tension, the chief replied, comes from stories passed down through families and communities. Stories of traffic stops that went wrong, of assumptions that led to tragedy, of simple misunderstandings that escalated because of fear on both sides. He paused, watching another car pass by. But you know what else gets passed down? Stories of officers who made a difference, who showed compassion, who took the time to listen and understand. A cool gust of wind rustled through the trees, carrying distant sounds of the city, sirens, music from a car stereo, the constant hum of urban life. The chief straightened up, his expression thoughtful. Tomorrow morning, I'm holding a briefing with all shift supervisors, he said. I'd like you to be there, Thompson. Not to single you out or embarrass you, but because what happened here tonight is a perfect starting point for some changes I've been wanting to implement. Thompson's eyes widened slightly. Changes, sir? Yes. You see, this encounter tonight, it's not unique. But what is unique is the opportunity it presents. You and we're going to turn this into something positive. The chief's voice took on an energetic tone, the kind that had helped him rise through the ranks and inspire others throughout his career. I'm thinking about a new training program, he continued. Not the usual PowerPoint presentations and role-playing scenarios, but real conversations like the one we're having right now. Bringing in community members to share their experiences, having officers talk openly about their assumptions and fears, creating a space for honest dialogue. A passing car's headlights swept across them, momentarily illuminating Thompson's thoughtful expression. Do you think other officers will be receptive to that, sir? The chief smiled. Some will resist, naturally. Change is never easy, especially when it requires us to examine our own biases. But you know what I've learned in my years on the force? Most officers want to do the right thing. They want to serve their community well. Sometimes they just need to be shown how their actions impact others. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. Let me show you something. He pulled up a photo of a community gathering from the previous weekend, officers playing basketball with local kids, sharing meals with residents, laughing and talking without the barrier of emergency calls or criminal investigations. This is what real policing looks like, Thompson. Not just responding to calls or making arrests, but building relationships, understanding the community we serve. Every traffic stop, every interaction, is an opportunity to either strengthen or damage those relationships. Thompson studied the photo, his expression softening. I remember seeing the notice about that event, but I didn't go. I thought it was just a PR thing. That's exactly the mindset we need to change, the chief replied. These aren't PR stunts, they're essential parts of our job. When we know our community, when they know us as people rather than just uniforms, everything changes. The next time you respond to a call in that neighborhood, you're not just the police, you're Officer Thompson, who played basketball with their kids or shared a meal at their community center. The night had grown quieter, but the energy between them had intensified. The chief could see the impact of their conversation in Thompson's posture, his expressions, the way he was truly listening and processing each word. I'll tell you something I've never shared with many people, the chief continued, his voice taking on a more personal tone. The day I decided to become a police officer, I had just witnessed a tense confrontation between an officer and a teenager in my neighborhood. The officer saw a threat, the teenager was just walking home from school. I watched how quickly assumptions and fear almost turned a simple moment into a tragedy. He paused, making sure Thompson was following his words. That day, I realized that change had to come from within the system. Every officer has the power to either reinforce stereotypes or break them down. Every interaction is a chance to build trust or erode it. Thompson's radio crackled with routine chatter, but he remained focused on the chief's words. The young officer's expression showed the kind of deep understanding that couldn't be taught in any academy class. Sir, about tonight. Thompson began, then hesitated. Yes? I want to do better. Not just because you're the chief, but because I see now how my actions affect more than just one traffic stop or one interaction. It's about the whole community's trust in us, isn't it? The chief nodded approvingly. That's exactly right. And you know what? Recognizing that is the first step toward real change. Tomorrow at the briefing, we're going to start something new. Something that I hope will ripple through the entire department. As they stood there under the streetlight, both men understood that this unexpected encounter had become something much more significant than a simple traffic stop. It had become a catalyst for change, a moment that would influence not just their department but potentially the way law enforcement and community relations evolved in their city. The chief checked his watch again. It's getting late, and we both have an early morning tomorrow. But remember this moment, Thompson. Remember how it felt to confront your own biases and choose to grow from them. That's the kind of courage we need in modern policing. The next morning arrived with the buzz of anticipation in the department's main conference room. Officers filed in, coffee cups in hand, their curious glances darting between Officer Thompson seated in the front row and the chief standing by the podium. The room held the usual morning briefing energy, but there was something different in the air, a sense that something significant was about to happen. The chief surveyed the room, noting the familiar faces of veterans and rookies alike. Sergeant Rivera, who'd served under him for 15 years, sat near the back, her experienced eyes already picking up on the unusual atmosphere. Lieutenant Chen, who headed the Community Outreach Division, had his notebook ready, sensing this wouldn't be a typical briefing. Good morning, the chief began, his voice carrying the same steady authority it had held during last night's conversation. Before we get to our usual updates, I want to share something that happened last night, something that's going to change how we approach our work going forward. The room fell silent, all eyes focused on their leader. The chief glanced at Thompson, giving him a subtle nod of encouragement. Last night, I was pulled over on Maple Avenue, he continued. And in that moment, I was reminded of something crucial about our role in this community. He paused, letting his words sink in. Officer Thompson, would you mind standing up and sharing your perspective on what happened? Thompson rose slowly, his uniform crisp but his face showing the weight of the moment. The young officer turned to face his colleagues, many of whom he'd only known for months. Last night, I made a traffic stop without proper cause, Thompson began, his voice initially hesitant but growing stronger. I pulled over a vehicle because... He paused, taking a deep breath, because I made assumptions based on appearance. What I didn't know was that I had stopped our chief. But what I learned afterward was far more important than who I had stopped. The room remained silent, but the energy had shifted. Some officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, perhaps recognizing their own experiences in Thompson's words. Others leaned forward, engaged by the raw honesty in their colleague's voice. The chief could have reprimanded me, written me up, or worse, Thompson continued. Instead, he took the time to have a real conversation with me. He helped me understand how my actions impact not just individual citizens, but entire communities' trust in law enforcement. The chief stepped forward, placing a supportive hand on Thompson's shoulder. What Officer Thompson demonstrated last night wasn't just courage in admitting his mistake, he showed the kind of self-reflection and willingness to learn that we need from every member of this department. Lieutenant Chen's pen moved rapidly across his notebook as the chief outlined his vision for the changes ahead. Starting today, we're implementing a new approach to community engagement and officer training. This isn't about pointing fingers or assigning blame. It's about growing together as a department and with our community. He clicked a button on the podium, and the screen behind him came to life with statistics, traffic stop data, complaint records, community satisfaction surveys. These numbers tell a story, but they don't tell the whole story. Behind each of these data points is a human interaction, a moment where we either build trust or erode it. Sergeant Rivera raised her hand. Chief, are you suggesting we change our traffic stop protocols? Not exactly, Sergeant. I'm suggesting we change how we think about every interaction we have with the public. He moved away from the podium, walking among the seated officers. Each of you joined this force to make a difference. To protect and serve. But somewhere along the way, some of us started seeing threats instead of community members, statistics instead of stories. The morning sun streamed through the conference room windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Outside, the city was coming to life, the community they had sworn to protect and serve. Over the next few weeks, we'll be rolling out new training programs, the chief continued. But these won't be your typical seminars. We'll be bringing in community members to share their experiences. We'll have open dialogues about bias, fear, and trust. And most importantly, we'll be creating opportunities for real connections between our officers and the neighborhoods they serve. He returned to the podium, his expression serious but hopeful. Last night's encounter could have gone very differently. It could have been just another traffic stop, just another moment of misunderstanding. Instead, it became a catalyst for change. That's what I want each of you to think about every time you put on this uniform. The chief gestured to a stack of folders on the table beside him. In these packets, you'll find the outline of our new community engagement initiative. But more than that, you'll find stories, real experiences from both officers and citizens. Because that's what this job is really about, the stories we create every day through our actions and decisions. As the briefing continued, the chief could see the impact of his words rippling through the room. Some officers were already discussing ideas amongst themselves, while others sat in thoughtful reflection. This was how change began, not with mandates from above, but with honest conversations and shared understanding. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, its light filling the room with a warm glow. Outside, patrol cars waited to carry officers into another day of service. But today felt different. Today marked the beginning of a new chapter in their department's story, one that would be written not just in policy changes and training programs, but in the countless small interactions between officers and the community they served. 2 weeks after the transformative traffic stop, the community center on Oak Street buzzed with activity. The chief stood at the back of the room, watching as officers and community members sat together in small groups, engaged in animated conversations. The scene before him was exactly what he had envisioned that night on Maple Avenue. Officer Thompson sat with an elderly gentleman who owned a local barbershop, their heads bent in serious discussion. The young officer had thrown himself into the new initiative with unexpected enthusiasm, often being the first to volunteer for community engagement activities. The chief could see the change in him. Gone was the rigid posture and automatic suspicion, replaced by genuine interest and empathy. "I've been cutting hair in this neighborhood for 40 years, the barbershop owner was saying, his hands moving expressively as he spoke. "I've seen how things have changed, both good and bad. But this? This is something new." He gestured around the room, where uniforms and civilian clothes mixed freely, where conversations flowed naturally instead of being stifled by tension. At another table, Sergeant Rivera was listening intently to a young mother describe her fears about her teenage son walking home from basketball practice at night. The sergeant's notebook lay open, but she wasn't writing, she was fully engaged in the conversation, nodding understanding as the mother shared her perspective. The chief moved through the room, catching snippets of conversations that would have been unimaginable just weeks ago. Officers were sharing their own vulnerabilities, their fears on the job, while community members opened up about their experiences with law enforcement, both positive and negative. Near the windows, Lieutenant Chen had gathered a small group discussing ways to improve communication during traffic stops. A high school teacher was describing how a simple explanation of why she was pulled over had completely changed her perspective on a recent encounter. "It wasn't just that he explained the reason," she said, her voice carrying across the quiet group. "It was how he did it, with respect, with clarity. He treated me like a person, not a potential threat." The chief thought back to his conversation with Thompson that night. Sometimes the biggest changes started with the smallest shifts in perspective. He watched as an older officer, known for his initial skepticism about the new initiative, leaned forward to share his own story. "You know, I've been on the force for 20 years, the veteran officer began, his voice gruff but sincere. "Always thought I was doing everything by the book. But listening to all of you today, it's making me see things differently. Maybe the book needs some revising." Outside the community center, life in the neighborhood continued as usual. Kids rode their bikes past the row of parked patrol cars, no longer giving them the wide berth they once did. An ice cream truck's melody drifted through the open windows, mixing with the sound of honest, sometimes difficult conversations. The chief checked his watch. They'd been at this for almost 3 hours, yet no one seemed eager to leave. In fact, new people kept arriving, drawn by word of mouth about what was happening inside the community center. He noticed Thompson excusing himself from his conversation and approaching. "Chief," Thompson said, his expression both serious and excited. "Remember how you talked about stories being passed down through communities? Well, we've been thinking." He gestured to include his conversation partner from the barbershop. "What if we started documenting these conversations? Not just for training purposes, but as a way to show both sides of the badge that change is possible?" The chief smiled, remembering his own words from that night. "Tell me more." "Well, sir, Mr. Washington here has been recording oral histories of the neighborhood for years. He's offered to help us create something similar with these discussions, a kind of living document of how community-police relations can evolve. Mr. Washington stepped forward, his dignified presence commanding attention. "Young man here tells me about that traffic stop," he said to the chief. "Reminds me of something my father used to say, sometimes the best lessons come from our biggest mistakes. But only if we're willing to learn from them." The chief looked around the room again, seeing how the initial awkwardness of the early meetings had melted away. Officers who once would have spent their breaks in the station were now choosing to be here, engaging in genuine dialogue with the people they served. A young girl, perhaps 12 or 13, had set up a lemonade stand in the corner, cheerfully serving both officers and residents. The chief watched as she handed a cup to Thompson, refusing his attempt to pay. "My mom says you're helping make our neighborhood better," he overheard her say. "The lemonade's on me." Lieutenant Chen approached with a stack of feedback forms from the previous week's sessions. "Sir, you might want to see these," he said, handing over the papers. "The response has been overwhelming. Other precincts are starting to ask about implementing similar programs." The chief leafed through the comments, noting the recurring themes of increased understanding and decreased tension. But it was the personal stories that caught his attention, accounts of changed perspectives on both sides, of small but significant shifts in daily interactions. One officer had written about how he'd started stopping by the local basketball court during his patrol, not to monitor but to shoot hoops with the kids. A resident described how she'd helped an officer understand the cultural significance of certain gatherings that had previously been viewed with suspicion. "You know what the best part is, Chief?" Thompson said, still holding his lemonade. "It's not just changing how we do our jobs. It's changing how we see ourselves doing our jobs. That traffic stop, it wasn't just about me learning something. It was about realizing how much we all need to learn from each other." The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows, but no one seemed to notice the time passing. In every corner of the room, bridges were being built, understanding was growing, and the divide between uniform and civilian was gradually, steadily narrowing. 1 month into the new initiative, the chief sat in his office reviewing the latest statistics. But unlike the usual dry numbers, these reports told stories of transformation. Traffic stop complaints had decreased by 40%. Community tip lines were receiving more calls, helping solve cases that might have otherwise gone cold. But it was the unofficial reports, the everyday stories filtering up through the ranks, that truly captured the change taking place. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. Officer Thompson stood in the doorway, accompanied by Sergeant Rivera. The young officer had grown into his role as one of the program's most vocal advocates, his initial mistake becoming a powerful teaching tool for other officers. "Chief, we had something happen last night that you should know about," Thompson began, his expression serious but hopeful. "Remember that corner store on Pine Street? The one that used to call us almost every weekend about suspicious teenagers?" The chief nodded, recalling the numerous incident reports from that location. The store owner's distrust of young people, particularly minorities, had been a constant source of tension in the neighborhood. "Well, last night was different," Rivera continued, pulling out her notebook. "The owner called, but not to complain. He wanted to tell us about how some of the local kids helped him chase down a real shoplifter. Said he realized he'd been looking at the wrong things all this time." The chief leaned back in his chair, gesturing for them to continue. Outside his window, the late afternoon sun painted the city in warm hues, a fitting backdrop for this story of changing perspectives. "It gets better," Thompson added, unable to hide his smile. "The store owner's now talking about starting a youth employment program. Says he wants to be part of the solution instead of just calling about problems. And you know what? Some of those same kids he used to call about are his biggest supporters now." The chief rose from his desk, moving to the wall where he'd hung photos from various community engagement events. Among them was a picture from that first night on Maple Avenue, a reminder of how a potentially negative encounter had sparked a movement for positive change. "You know what this reminds me of?" he said, turning back to his officers. "Something my grandfather used to say about gardens. He'd tell me that pulling up weeds isn't enough, you have to plant something good in their place. That's what we're doing here. We're not just addressing problems, we're growing solutions." Just then, Lieutenant Chen appeared in the doorway, tablet in hand. "Sorry to interrupt, Chief, but you're going to want to see this." The body cam footage from Officer Rodriguez's traffic stop last night just came in. It's something special." They gathered around Chen's tablet as he played the video. It showed a routine traffic stop, but what unfolded was anything but routine. The officer approached the vehicle with respect, clearly explained the reason for the stop, and engaged in a genuine conversation with the driver. When it turned out the driver was rushing to pick up his child from daycare, Rodriguez not only gave him directions to a faster route but also called ahead to the daycare to explain the situation. "This is exactly what we've been working toward," the chief said, his voice filled with pride. "Not just enforcing laws, but understanding the human stories behind every encounter." Rivera nodded in agreement. "The best part? Rodriguez was one of our biggest skeptics when we started this program. Now he's teaching other officers how to turn routine stops into opportunities for connection." The chief walked to the window, looking out over the city he'd sworn to protect and serve. In the month since that fateful traffic stop, he'd seen changes he'd once thought would take years to achieve. But he also knew they were just beginning. "We're getting requests from other departments," Thompson added, holding up a stack of emails. "They want to know how we're doing this, how we're making it work. The State Police Academy is even asking about incorporating our approach into their training program." The chief smiled, remembering his own academy days. How different things might have been if these lessons had been taught from the beginning. But it wasn't too late, it was never too late for positive change. "Tell me about the challenges," he said, turning back to his officers. "What are we still struggling with?" Rivera sighed, flipping through her notebook. "We've got some veterans who are still resistant. They see this as soft policing, worry it'll make officers hesitate in dangerous situations. And there are community members who remain skeptical, who've been hurt too many times to trust quickly." "Good," the chief replied, surprising them. "Those challenges mean we're dealing with reality, not just putting on a show. Real change isn't about quick fixes or perfect solutions. It's about steady progress, even when it's difficult. Especially when it's difficult." A commotion in the hallway drew their attention. A group of officers was returning from a community basketball tournament, their uniforms dusty from play, their faces bright with genuine enjoyment. The sound of their laughter and animated conversation filled the usually quiet administrative wing. "You hear that?" the chief asked. "That's the sound of barriers breaking down. A few months ago, those officers would have driven past that basketball court, watching for trouble. Now they're part of the game." Thompson moved to the chief's wall of photos, pointing to one from the previous week's community center meeting. "Sir, remember what you told me that night? About how every interaction is a chance to build trust or erode it. I see it now, in every shift. The small moments matter just as much as the big ones." The chief nodded, picking up a recent report from his desk. "Look at these numbers. Response times are down, not because we're driving faster, but because people are more willing to give us accurate information. Community tips have led to peaceful resolutions in situations that might have escalated. We're not just policing differently, we're policing better." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the office, the chief reflected on how far they'd come and how far they still had to go. The incident on Maple Avenue could have been just another statistic, just another moment of tension between law enforcement and the community. Instead, it had become a catalyst for real, lasting change. "You know what the real success is?" he asked his officers. It's not in these reports or statistics. It's in the stories people are starting to tell about us. Not stories of fear or distrust, but stories of partnership, of understanding, of shared humanity. That's how we know we're making a difference. 2 months after the Maple Avenue encounter, the department's largest conference room was filled beyond capacity. Police chiefs and community leaders from neighboring cities had gathered to learn about the transformation that had caught the attention of law enforcement agencies across the state. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation as the chief prepared to share their story. Standing at the podium, he surveyed the diverse crowd before him. Officer Thompson sat in the front row alongside Mr. Washington from the barbershop, both ready to share their perspectives on the journey. Representatives from civil rights organizations mixed with veteran officers, their usual adversarial relationship replaced by a shared interest in positive change. 2 months ago, the chief began, a routine traffic stop changed not just our department, but our entire approach to community policing. Today, I'm not here to present a perfect solution or a miracle cure. I'm here to share a story of how one honest conversation sparked a movement. The presentation screen behind him displayed photos from their community initiatives, officers playing chess in the park with elderly residents, youth mentorship programs, community feedback sessions. Each image told a story of barriers being broken down and trust being built. The numbers tell part of the story, he continued, switching to a slide showing their latest statistics. Complaints down, community cooperation up, crime rates declining. But the real story isn't in these charts. It's in the daily interactions that never make it into our reports. He gestured to Thompson, who stood and addressed the room. The young officer's confidence had grown remarkably over the past months, his initial mistake transformed into a powerful testimony of change. Before that night on Maple Avenue, I thought I knew what good policing looked like, Thompson shared. I was wrong. Good. Policing isn't about authority or control, it's about connection, understanding, and shared humanity. A police chief from a neighboring city raised her hand. This all sounds impressive, but how do you maintain proper police authority while building these community relationships? Aren't you worried about officers becoming too lenient? The chief smiled, having anticipated this concern. Actually, we've found the opposite to be true. When community members trust us, they're more likely to comply with lawful commands. When officers understand the community better, they make better judgment calls. Authority isn't diminished by understanding, it's enhanced by it. Mr. Washington stood next, his dignified presence commanding attention. I've lived in this city for 50 years, he began, his voice carrying decades of experience. Seen all kinds of programs come and go. But this is different. For the first time, we're not just talking about change, we're living it, every day, in small ways that add up to something big. The room fell silent as he shared stories from his barbershop, how officers now stopped by regularly, not to patrol but to connect. How young people who once ducked away from police now engaged with them. How conversations that would have been impossible months ago were now happening daily. Lieutenant Chen took the floor next, presenting their training materials and implementation strategies. We've learned that this isn't about adding more programs or policies, he explained. It's about changing the culture of policing itself, one interaction at a time. A community activist who had long been critical of the police department raised her hand. I've seen the changes in my neighborhood, she acknowledged. But what happens when there's turnover in the department? How do you ensure this outlasts any single chief or officer? The chief stepped forward to address this crucial question. That's why we're documenting everything, the successes and the failures, the strategies that work and those that don't. We're building this into our training, our protocols, our daily operations. But most importantly, we're changing the stories that both officers and community members tell about each other. He clicked to a new slide showing a recent incident where potential unrest had been diffused through community intervention. Last week, we had a situation that could have escalated into a serious confrontation. Instead, community leaders who've been part of our program stepped in. They didn't just help us maintain peace, they helped us understand the underlying issues and address them. Sergeant Rivera shared how the department's approach to routine calls had evolved. We've started asking different questions, she explained. Not just, what's the problem, but, what's the story here? How can we help? It takes more time initially, but it saves countless hours of repeated calls and escalating tensions. As the presentation continued, the chief noticed something remarkable happening in the room. The usual divide between law enforcement and community representatives was dissolving. People who might have sat on opposite sides of the room were now engaging in earnest conversation during breaks, exchanging contact information, making plans to collaborate. This isn't just about changing police departments, he told them as the session neared its end. It's about changing the entire dynamic between law enforcement and the communities we serve. Every city has its own Maple Avenue moment waiting to happen, a moment when we can choose to either reinforce old barriers or break them down. A young officer from another department raised his hand. How do you handle resistance from officers who think this is too soft or too idealistic? Thompson stood again, addressing his fellow officer directly. I was that skeptic once. But here's what I've learned, true strength isn't in maintaining distance or authority. It's in having the courage to connect, to admit mistakes, to learn and grow. The hardest thing I've ever done as an officer was confronting my own biases, and it's also been the most rewarding. The chief watched as heads nodded throughout the room. Change was spreading, not through mandate or policy, but through shared stories and experiences. The transformation that began on Maple Avenue was becoming a blueprint for departments across the region. As the session ended, people lingered, forming small groups, sharing experiences and contact information. The chief overheard snippets of conversation about implementing similar programs, adapting the training materials, building bridges in their own communities. This is just the beginning, he told his team as they gathered afterward. What started as one traffic stop is becoming a movement. But remember, it's not about creating a perfect system. It's about being willing to have those difficult conversations, to learn from our mistakes, to see each interaction as an opportunity for positive change. Looking out at the setting sun through his office window, the chief reflected on how far they'd come. The city below was the same, yet somehow different, transformed not by grand gestures or sweeping reforms, but by countless small moments of understanding and connection, each building on the last, creating a new narrative of what community policing could be. 6 months after that fateful night on Maple Avenue, the chief found himself driving the same route home. The street looked the same, lined with mature trees, modest homes, and the familiar glow of streetlights, but everything else had changed. As he approached the spot where Officer Thompson had pulled him over that night, he noticed a group of teenagers playing basketball in a driveway, waving casually at a passing patrol car instead of tensing up. He pulled into the community center parking lot, where a town hall meeting was about to begin. This wasn't just another community outreach event, it was a celebration of 6 months of transformation, and a planning session for the future. Inside, the usual folding chairs had been arranged in a circle rather than rows, symbolic of the new relationship between law enforcement and the community. Officer Thompson was already there, chatting easily with a group of residents. The nervous rookie who had made that traffic stop 6 months ago had grown into a respected bridge builder within the department. He'd recently been promoted to lead the new community engagement training program, teaching other officers the lessons he'd learned that night. "Chief," Thompson called out, waving him over. "You need to hear this. Tell him what you just told me," he said to a teenage boy standing nearby. The teenager, wearing a basketball jersey and a confident smile, stepped forward. "I was just saying how different things feel now. Last summer, my friends and I used to take the long way home from practice to avoid police cars. Now?" He gestured to the officer standing beside him. Officer Rodriguez here is helping us organize a police community basketball tournament next month." The chief smiled, remembering how Rodriguez had once been one of the most skeptical officers about the new initiatives. Now he was one of its strongest advocates, often telling newer officers, "We didn't just change how we police, we changed why we police." The community center filled quickly as residents and officers arrived for the meeting. The chief noticed how naturally they mingled, no longer segregating themselves into uniform and civilian groups. Mr. Washington from the barbershop was there, along with other business owners who had once viewed police presence as a threat rather than a partnership. "Before we start," the chief announced as people settled into their seats, "I want to share something with you all." He pulled out a letter that had arrived that morning. "This is from the State Police Academy. They've officially adopted our community engagement program as part of their core curriculum. What started here, on our streets, is now going to shape the next generation of officers across the state." Applause filled the room, but the chief raised his hand for quiet. "That's not all. The success of our program has caught the attention of departments across the country. Next month, we're hosting representatives from 50 major cities who want to learn from our experience." Sergeant Rivera, who had been analyzing the data, stood up with her tablet. "The numbers tell an incredible story," she reported. "Traffic stop complaints down by 70%. Community tip success rate up by 60%. Crime rates declining in areas where we've implemented the most intensive community engagement programs. But the most important changes can't be measured in statistics." She gestured to a wall where photos from the past 6 months were displayed. Images of officers reading to children at the library, community members and police working together to clean up parks, youth mentorship programs, and countless small moments of connection and understanding. "Remember when we started this?" Thompson asked, addressing the room. "Some people thought we were going soft on crime. Others thought it was just another PR stunt. But look at us now. We're not just enforcing laws, we're building a community." A retired officer who had initially resisted the changes raised his hand. "I need to say something," he began, his voice gruff with emotion. "I've been in law enforcement for 30 years. Thought I knew everything there was to know about good policing. But these past 6 months have taught me more than the previous 30 years combined. I was wrong, and I'm glad I was wrong." The chief watched as heads nodded around the room. Change hadn't always been easy. There had been setbacks, resistance, and moments of doubt. But the transformation had taken root, growing stronger with each passing day. Lieutenant Chen presented the plans for the next phase of their initiative. "We're expanding our youth programs, creating more opportunities for positive interactions between officers and young people. The summer internship program at the department is already oversubscribed, with students who once avoided police now wanting to learn about law enforcement careers." As the meeting continued, the chief reflected on how that single traffic stop had catalyzed such profound change. It hadn't just improved police-community relations, it had fundamentally altered how both officers and residents viewed each other and themselves. Near the end of the meeting, a young mother stood up, holding her sleeping toddler. "6 months ago, I used to tell my son to be careful around police officers," she said, her voice steady but emotional. "Now I tell him that they're here to help, and I actually believe it. That's the real change, not just in what we do, but in what we believe is possible." The chief rose to close the meeting, but found himself momentarily overwhelmed by the significance of the moment. In his 30 years of service, he had seen countless initiatives come and go, but this was different. This wasn't just a program or a policy, it was a fundamental shift in the culture of policing. 6 months ago, on Maple Avenue, 2 officers had a conversation that could have gone very differently, he began. "Instead of conflict, we chose connection. Instead of punishment, we chose growth. That choice has rippled out far beyond that street corner, far beyond our department, far beyond what any of us could have imagined." He looked around the room, at faces both familiar and new, at uniforms and civilian clothes, at the barriers that had once seemed insurmountable now dissolved by understanding and shared purpose. But our work isn't finished, he continued. Every day brings new challenges, new opportunities to either build trust or erode it. The choice we made that night on Maple Avenue, to listen, to learn, to grow, that's a choice we have to make every day, in every interaction. As the meeting ended and people began to disperse, the chief watched Officer Thompson speaking with a group of young officers from neighboring departments. The spark that had been ignited that night was spreading, carrying the possibility of change to other communities, other departments, other officers facing their own moments of choice. Outside, the evening was settling over the city they all served. The same streets, the same buildings, the same community, but transformed by 6 months of small choices, daily efforts, and the courage to imagine a different way of policing. As the chief drove home along Maple Avenue, he smiled, knowing that somewhere tonight, another officer might be facing their own transformative moment, their own opportunity to choose connection over conflict, understanding over assumption, growth over stagnation. The story that began with a traffic stop had become something much larger, a testament to the power of human connection and the possibility of positive change, one interaction at a time.